Hi everyone, welcome back to LIS-570. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be focusing on data collection and then data analysis across research methods. We'll focus first on qualitative research traditions, and then we'll look at quantitative research traditions. So before we get started into the data collection methods that go along with qualitative research, I thought it would be useful for us to think about where it is the rest of the course content, that is, everything that we've talked about up until this point, really fits into the work that we're going to do now to operationalize the research questions that we formulated. I think this is kind of a fun exercise in freshening up and taking a step towards making connections between a number of things that we've already talked about in the class. So I'll spend about 10 minutes giving a review, and then the rest of this week we're going to jump into qualitative data collection methods. All right, so let's get started. So if you remember way back to week 1 of the course, the first thing that we talked about were the idea of paradigms of research. And we said that these paradigms consisted of a set of commitments that we had about the way that we either viewed reality or the way that we thought there were justified true beliefs about the world. Now, we talked about, in particular, ontologies as being about what kind of commitments we had in the assumptions or the values that we espoused as individuals that tethered us to some sort of belief about ways that we can know things. And this leads us to our epistemic or our epistemological beliefs about the world. And these tend to do more with how we accept or refute evidence. And then we kind of waved our hands at, but what we're going to start to jump into now is this idea of putting those assumptions to work through a set of methods. Methods we can think of as the tools and techniques that we collect and then analyze data in order to justify some of the beliefs that we hold. So all of these things, of course, feed into what we think of as a research paradigm. And we talked about kind of 2 of the most basic research paradigms that are existing in social science research, but that are prevalent in library and information science. So we started out by talking about positivism and constructivism. So if you remember that positivism is really this ontological commitment to there being a reality that exists out there. And this commitment or this belief really tethers us to then thinking about knowledge, that is how we know what we know, through the search for kind of true meaning. We believe that we can build an inference or a logic that ties us to, say, right or wrong answers. And then oppositely, we have something like constructivism, or we also call this interpretivism. Now, interpretivists believe that there's not one true reality, but there's multiple realities, and those realities tend to be socially constructed. That is, we tend to understand and know through things like language, through things like our relationships and communities that we build. Now, all of these social constructions really commit us to an epistemology that says there could be multiple truths, there could be multiple right answers. And so if this is the case, then we're going to be in search of trying to synthesize and bring together multiple forms of evidence so that we can make a claim, but also our partner might make a claim. And they may be just as right as us. It depends on sort of the way that we negotiate and the way that we accept claims within our field or within our community in terms of who gets to be right or who gets to be wrong. Now, constructivists also, it's important to remember, place a huge emphasis on the idea or the notion of power. And those power dynamics come to play between, say, researcher and participants, between people that are members of a community, even between instructor and student, right? So constructivists, although not always, tend to have a preoccupation with the way that power interprets or impacts the data that are going to be ultimately collected and analyzed. So let's jump ahead then to what we talked about last week, which is the design stage of our research. So we use these epistemic and ontological commitments to think about what kinds of problems we thought were interesting in the world. And those problems led us to articulating what were a set of research questions that we wanted to ask and ultimately answer. We could choose anything from maybe the way that people gain access to online resources to the way in which maybe a homeless population finds and resources certain types of needs that they have in a living situation, right? So we have a huge range of things that we can ask and we can answer through our research questions. Now, our research questions tied us into or allowed us to identify a kind of community that we wanted to speak to and that we wanted to also be informed by. Now, we took the steps then, or we're taking them this week, to do a literature review, which allowed us to figure out, well, what has everyone else said about this topic? What are the research questions that other people have looked at in, say, advancing our knowledge or our understanding of a phenomena like digital literacy? What kinds of methods did they use, and what kinds of answers did they come up with? All of these things help us to better understand the way in which we might rigorously advance our own understanding of and our own answers to the research questions that we want to ask and that we think are important. All right, so this leads us to then the design stage. And the design stage had a number of kind of sub things that we were going to be, or sub activities that we were going to be engaged in order to get our projects from conceptualization to execution. At the design stage, one of the things that we focused on initially was differentiating between a unit of analysis and a unit of observation. So if we have some broader construct that we're interested in analyzing, then we need to find a way in which we call operationalizing, that is putting that an analytic concept to a specific concrete example. And those units of observation then become what we ultimately want to collect data about. And so we talked about once we have a unit of analysis and a unit of observation identified, then our next step would be to think about, well, if we have a whole population of people or things or objects that we want to study, what's a reliable way that we can take a small sample that would be representative of that population? Now, our sampling depends on kind of what we expect in terms of true justified beliefs. That is, how we expect an answer to be representative of an entire population. If we're working from a positivist standpoint, we're probably assuming that there's some statistical test we can run to prove our representativeness. If we're working from a qualitative standpoint, what we're trying to do is advance an argument about why we create the sample the way that we do and why this represents ultimately the population that we want to make claims about or for. Now, we waved our hands at two really important things that we're going to dive into this week in talking about data collection, which was the way that we manage data that we collect and the way that we use instruments to systematically collect data for analysis. Now, both instruments and planning for data management require us to identify the exact kind of method we want to use and understand the logic behind why we use it and the best ways to use it. So this is what we're engaged in this week, is figuring out, well, if I know a population that I want to study, what is the best way to get some information from those individuals, or in a constructivist sense, how do I make meaning with the sample of population that I've identified? So there's kind of an important set of reasoning or logic that has undergirded our work so well. And I think that this is kind of crept out from the shadows and is starting to show itself to us as we take this step from designing to actually executing our work. And what's coming up, or what's becoming clear to us, is that we're probably working from one set of reasoning or another set of reasoning. Those reasonings being, we're either thinking about our research inductively or deductively. So let's take a closer look at what we mean here. So induction is often the process of moving from particulars to generalizations, whereas deduction is the process of moving from generalizations to particular concrete examples. So the implications here are really important, though, for the way that we think about, well, how we might go about then collecting data to answer our research questions. Because if we're working inductively, what we're starting out with is some maybe basic assumptions about what kind of area we're working in, and some basic assumptions about who the population and the units of analysis or observation are. But what we're looking to do in the collection of our data is make sense of it on our own through pattern making. And through that pattern making, we'll develop some sort of hypothesis which explains, well, why do students, when they enter a computer lab, automatically log on in the way that they do? Why do they enter data in a spreadsheet in the ways that they do? Why is there a confusion consistently around the concept of, say, a variable and a function when using a spreadsheet? All of these things would be observations that we make, and we may come up with hypotheses which explain those observations. Now, when we have enough evidence or data behind the hypotheses that we've come up with, we start to move towards a theory, that is, some overarching explanation which can operate at a population level. That is, our hypotheses may prove true for a particular sample, but when we move to theory, we're thinking about this being a generalization, right? Something that's going to be applicable to maybe any sample of a population that we may ultimately study. Deduction works almost exactly the opposite way. So someone working with a deductive logic is going to start from a theory about the way that the world works, such as, why do people vote the way that they vote based on their geolocation? So we may have a hypothesis about the way that people vote based on their geolocation, and it may have something to do with rural voters tend to be more distrustful than, say, urban voters. And so we may have a hypothesis which explains some portion of that theory, and we'll want to test that hypothesis by designing either an experiment or designing some sort of data collection event in which we can make observations about our hypothesis, and then ultimately either confirm or deny, reject our hypothesis. So the process of deduction is going to move from the general, the research has shown this, the research has explained why differences in geography are evident in polling numbers or voting numbers, but we have a specific hypothesis that we want to test, and we want to understand ways that that hypothesis may prove to refine or improve our theory, right? And so that improvement or that refinement is what deductive work is all about in terms of theory. It's trying to take a generalization, find a concrete particular example, and then improve the accuracy or the sophistication of a theory. So if you're a savvy lecture listener, and I'm sure that you all are, you're looking at both of these and thinking, well, is our goal here always in doing research to build or confirm or deny theory? A lot of social scientists approach the world with just that ambition, right? They want generalizations which can always improve sort of the interpretive or the descriptive, discursive knowledge that we have. I don't think that that's always the case for the work that I'm interested in doing, and I think you'll find lots of people in library and information science that aren't too concerned with theorizations or generalizations. Oftentimes, we're engaged in empirical, rigorous, careful research for the process of wanting to understand or confirm hypotheses about just our sample, about just our maybe smaller population than the kind of general nationwide population that we may think of. We want to understand how service level offerings in our particular branch library works. And will that branch library be able to be extended to, say, a whole system? Now, that's kind of what we might call a middle range theory. We might have ambitions which are not about the wide world and how we understand or believe. We may have ambitions which are pretty applied and that we want to root in particular samples of particular populations. So, to answer the question of, is the goal of research always theory? Absolutely not. A lot of the times what we're trying to do is generate things that we're certain about and then apply those findings, such as they can help people meaningfully intervene in their jobs. And this is the way that I think of most exceptionally useful, and I think exceptionally fun library and information science research. So let's sum up or try and think about sort of where we're going then for the rest of the semester, understanding this logic of induction or deduction that shapes our work. So we have our research questions in our literature review. Now these probably already, whether we were cognizant of it or not, had some implications about whether we would use inductive or deductive logic. And as we start to design our research, as we did last week, and as we do going forward, we're going to think then, well, executing our research requires us to maybe either make some observations or design some hypotheses such that we can make observations. So the first thing that we're going to do, or the first types of things that we're going to talk about when we move from designing to executing our research, is how we go about collecting systematically and rigorously observations of our samples. And this is what we're going to talk about for this week, and in a couple of weeks what we'll talk about for quantitative data collection.